My name is Hadi Fowler, and thank you for joining us. And I'm a managing broker of Fairview Realty, and I'm going to hand the show to Mary, and she's going to start talking about sublease or not to sublease, right?
Yep, sounds good, Hadi. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. And thanks for listening to our chit chat at the beginning. But we'll go ahead and, like Hadi said, start the formal meeting. And we always start our meetings with a disclaimer just to remind everybody that we're giving you information, for education, for informational purposes, but always double check it. Check with your own attorney, your contractors, whoever your team members are, because everybody's situation is different. We were just talking about how the subsurbs are this particular, situation. Well, that the information that we're giving you might apply to that area, but maybe it doesn't apply to your area. So just double check everything that we are talking about. And as Hadi mentioned, today's topic is sort of a question, should landlords allow subleasing? And let me give you a little bit of a background as to why we're doing this topic. And I'm glad to see, I'm pretty sure the person who asked me this question is on today's meeting. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't want to mention his name, but if he wants to, say, yeah, hey, I'm the person, he's more than welcome to. But this person emailed me a question. Hey, I got this situation where one of my tenants wants to sublease. I really don't want to, can you help me out? Sure. I thought, okay, yeah, the answer is easy, blah, 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 2 sentences done. And then I started typing it out. I'm like, oh my God, this situation is actually a little bit more complicated. It depends on what type of sublease. It depends on what area you're in, and it just sort of ballooned and got a little bit more complex. So I thought it would make a little bit of a good topic for our presentation, since I haven't come across this before, but it is a common topic that comes up. And as I'll mention this again later on, but a lot of landlords are like, no, 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 I don't want to do it. So it would be a good topic for us to review here. Let's see. Somebody type in the chat. Okay, Michael was talking about okay, Michael, you're mentioning one of the ordinances, and we'll definitely talk about it because that was one of the qualifiers that came about why we decided to do today's topic. And then I know before we launch into the topic, I know I always say this, but today's topic is going to be short. It's got little twists and turns, but it's not this giant convoluted topic. So we'll hopefully keep it, pretty on track here today. So what we're going to talk about today then is just give you a definition. Hey, what is a sublease? We're going to talk about 2 different types of subleases. What type of clauses, should you include in your leases to handle the sublease situation? Then we're going to take a look at, are we required to do the subleases? And then at the end, we'll take a look at, what are some of the pros? What are some of the cons? What are some of the tips landlords should follow when they are considering doing subleases? Okay, we always most of the times we start out our topics by just taking a look at a definition of the topic that we're going to talk about. Again, just to make sure that everybody's on the same page, has a clear understanding about what we're talking about for the term of the day. So what is a sublease? It's when somebody, the landlord or the tenant, re-rent a property by an existing tenant to a new tenant. So there are 3 parties involved: the landlord, the existing tenant, and a new tenant. The new tenant has the same rights and obligations as the old tenant does under the existing lease. The curious part, though, is even though you have a new tenant, that doesn't let your original tenant sort of off the hook. They are still on the hook according to the old lease. So they still actually retain rights to the property. They're still obligated, they're on the hook for that rent. If that new tenant that they sublease to doesn't pay the rent, they're still on the hook for that rent. And that original tenant is still bound by all of the lease terms. So if the new tenant, punches holes in the walls or otherwise causes some sort of damage, that original tenant is still going to be charged by the landlord, is still, on the hook for these new damages, evictions, everything that you have under the lease for the new tenant still applies to the old tenant. And I think a lot of tenants don't realize that. They just think, okay, I need to get it out of my lease. And we'll, here in a couple of slides, we'll look at why some of the original tenants want to get out of the lease. But the original tenants say, okay, I need to get out of my lease. I'm going to sublease it. Here you go. Here's the new tenant. That's it. I'm done. I'm washing my hands. That's not the case. I think a lot of tenants, the original tenants, don't realize that they are still bound by all of the lease terms, including any unpaid rent. So according to the sublease, then that original tenant sort of becomes a landlord to the new tenant. So we'll expand upon this here in a little bit. Question from Jeffrey: can you charge for the same credit and investigative checks you would make for a vacancy? So Jeffrey, great question. The answer is yes, but let me expand upon that when we get to that section, because we're absolutely going to talk about that being an essential step when you do a sublease. Okay, so that's what a sublease is. You have a lease and it gets re-rented from the old tenant to a new tenant. There's two different types of subleases, and this is why the person who asked me the question, I thought, the answer was going to be simple, but it turned out to be a little bit more complicated because of the two different types of subleases. So the first one is when the original tenant, you signed the lease at the beginning of the tenancy. This is the original tenant. They continue to live at that property. They don't move out, but what they decide to do is maybe rent out a portion of the property, and this creates a sublease situation. So I think all of you guys are familiar with the situation. Maybe, you're still the landlord, you still have a tenant, but then that tenant decides to maybe rent out a bedroom or a basement, or decide to, take on roommates. It's sort of like a roommate situation. Or maybe, a roommate leaves and they say, hey, I'm going to find a replacement for me and, let me out of the lease. So this is one sublease situation. The other type of sublease, though, is when the original tenant that you, the landlord, signed a lease with doesn't remain at the property. They move out of the property and then they rent out the entire portion of the property to a new tenant. And then that new tenant takes over the remaining part of the original tenant's lease. Hopefully that makes sense. So you got the original tenant who stays there and rents out a portion, or the original tenant moves out. They just want to, get rid of their lease and they find somebody to take over the remaining portion of their lease. And this sometimes happens because the original tenant, for whatever reason, they need to or want to break their lease and leave early. We had a whole, I think actually there were 2 landlord workshop meetings about this, early lease terminations. Sometimes life happens or there's an emergency. Maybe somebody loses their job, they get married, there's just a huge list of possible reasons why your original tenant just doesn't want to or can't live at the property anymore. So what happens then is this original tenant, they're the ones who find somebody to completely take over the remaining lease with you. The interesting part about this one is that the original tenant then becomes the landlord. They're the ones that are in charge of collecting the rent and enforcing the lease terms with that new tenant. It's not you. So it's not me, the original owner landlord, who now has this relationship with this new tenant. It's the original tenant who has the landlord relationship with the new tenant. Okay? So those are the 2 different types of subleases there are. And that's why the situation gets a little bit complicated. So what happens with these subleases? So I'm not sure about you guys, but I know the person who asked me the question said, oh, I don't want to do it. And for me too, the same thing. When I think of subleases, right in my mind, I say, nope, I don't want to do it. No, I just don't want to do it. So I think there's sort of a stigma in that most landlords, we don't want to do subleasing. We don't like the subleasing. Why? And this is something that Jeffrey just mentioned here. Why don't we like it? A couple of different reasons. Hey, I haven't screened that new tenant. I don't know who this tenant is. When we list our properties for rent, we go through this whole leasing process where we have multiple opportunities to get to know the applicant who's going to become our tenant. We, ask them for documents. We screen them. We get to know their credit history. We get to talk to their previous landlord, all those different steps that you do. And you get multiple chances to talk to this new tenant. You sort of become a little bit more comfortable in saying, okay, yeah, I can work with this person. I can accept this person being a new tenant. But if you all of a sudden get a new tenant forced upon you through a sublease, I think that makes us really uneasy because we haven't screened them and we don't know who this person is. Another reason why landlords don't like subleases is because if there are any problems, we as the landlord are now going to have to deal not only with the original tenant, because don't forget that they're still on the hook for this lease. Now we're also going to have to mess around with the new tenant. So the legal situation just gets very hairy, very difficult, especially if the new tenant is not fulfilling their obligations. other reason it makes us uneasy, I think, is we sort of lose control. We don't have a lease between ourselves and the new tenant. Remember, the lease is between ourselves and the old tenant, the original tenant there. Since there's no formal lease relationship, I think for a lot of us, it just makes us uneasy. It sort of makes us feel like we're losing a little bit of the control there in that situation. Sometimes what happens is there's a little bit of a misunderstanding too between the original tenant and the new one. The new tenant sometimes doesn't understand that, hey, I am on the hook for, for the lease. I am responsible for the rent and I have to stick to all of the lease terms. Sometimes they mistakenly think, hey, I'm not going to get in trouble. It's the original guy who's going to be on the hook. Partly that's true, but they are fully responsible for everything as well. So sometimes that also can cause a situation. And then the last reason here is I'm not sure if everybody's familiar with it. I mean, everybody's familiar, I think, with short-term rentals, Airbnbs, VRBOs, what's that other one? Home away, those types of situations. But I'm not sure if everybody quite understands it. A lot of those are actually sublease situations where you have a landlord who owns a rental property, and then somebody comes along and says, hey, I want to rent your property out and turn it into an Airbnb. And a lot of landlords are like, yeah, okay, I'll do that. And they create this sublease situation where the Airbnbs now, your rental property gets turned into an Airbnb, and you actually don't, of course, you don't have a lease relationship with the guests who stay there, but you do have a sublease relationship between yourself and the person who's managing that Airbnb. Unfortunately, that has turned into a real danger with the proliferation of all of these Airbnbs all over the place. Sometimes tenants turn the rental properties into Airbnbs without even asking the landlord. They don't get their permission. There's lots of stories where there's all of a sudden the police get called, or there's a situation that arises, and the landlord finds out, oh my God, my tenant has turned my property into an Airbnb, and then everything gets mixed up. Everything just turns really complicated. So this is why a lot of landlords just don't like having subleases in there. Okay, somebody had a really long, you did okay, so the person who reached out to me I confirm he did join our presentation out. And Gerard, I'll have you maybe talk a little bit here at the end when we get through our presentation. So thank you for letting me know that you're here. Okay, so I just wanted to maybe review this because I think a lot of you guys like me, when you hear sublease, nope, I just don't want to do it. But we'll take a look at some of the reasons why we should, and take a look at some of the dangers. We'll review the dangers like we did here again. Okay, so now let's do a quick poll. I call it a poll, but this one is really more of like a test, like a pre-test. Let's say you have a sublease situation that comes up. Can you say no? Can you say, nope, I'm not going to allow my tenant to sublease? So what do you say? Do landlords have to allow subleases? Yes or no? Let's see. Okay. Oh, okay. Virginia, I did notice you joined. Thank you. Howdy, Virginia. Well, when we get to the end here, I'm going to have you guys maybe give us some situations to see if any one of your tenants have ever, done a sublease or anything. So just, if you don't mind, think about it and see if you can come up with any examples. We'll get to it here in a little bit. All right. So let's end like it's not really a poll. It's like a pre-test here. But do landlords have to allow subleases? Yes or no? Very interesting. It's almost evenly split. So yes, 56%, no, 44%. So I guess this is a little bit of a trick question. So neither one of them is quite right. It's really, the answer is it depends. Sorry, it's a little bit of a trick question. So both of you are a little bit right, and both of you guys are a little bit wrong. But it really is going to depend on what your lease says, and it's going to depend on what area you're in. So this is why I'm very glad that the yeses and nos were sort of evenly split, because it shows that, we do have a little bit to learn about this topic, and this is why we decided to do it here. Okay, so let's take a look at the situations as, the answer to this question. Can landlords prohibit subleasing? Like, as I mentioned, it depends on, what type of sublease you're doing, and it depends on where your rental property is located. And I think all of us can guess that if we're in Cook County or Chicago, We always have those fun our TLOs and ordinances, and they definitely have something to say about it. Okay, so let's remember we had those two different types of subleases that I mentioned. Let's take a look to see whether landlords are allowed to prohibit the type 1 of sublease. So this type, remember, is where the original tenant continues to live at the property and they're basically just renting out maybe the basement or a bedroom or something. And this creates a new sublease between themselves and the themselves, who is a tenant, and the new tenant. So the answer to this one is, can landlords prohibit this type of subleasing? Yes, landlords can prohibit this type of subleasing. That's good because if I'm renting, me, the landlord, I rent my rental property out to somebody. I don't want them turning it into a rooming situation where you've got all of a sudden 5 other roommates or, people coming and going. So that's really good because we can say, nope, I do not allow, subleasing here. And this is what this bullet point says. We as landlords, we don't want tenants renting out a portion of the property. All of our leases generally say renting out the entire property. Not only do we not want it that way, we also have to be careful if our rental properties are in HOA, because of course I haven't checked every single HOA rule and regulation, but I'm willing to bet all of them say they do not allow renting out portions of the properties. I took a look at my rental properties that I have in HOA, and specifically right on there in the rules and regulations, it says if you rent a property out, you have to rent out the entire property. Portions of the property cannot be rented out. So if you don't want the situation to occur at your rental property where you lease it out to a tenant and then that tenant turns around and then subleases out to one or multiple people, you have to be careful to make sure that you include a clause in your lease that prohibits subleasing. So let's take a look at what some of these lease clauses should look like. And I'm willing to bet, this is like a standard. Honey, wouldn't you say that this is like a lease clause that is included in most leases? Let me show you what it looks like. Oh, before I do that, let me show you. You can either say, hey, I'm not going to allow any subleasing, or you can say, I'm not going to allow subleasing unless you ask me first, the written request. So let's take a look at one of these lease clauses. So very simple. It says a tenant agrees not to transfer, assign, or sublease right here the lease premises. That's all you have to say in there. Now, if you don't, want them to do it at all, that's just cut it off right here at the little red diagonal. If you want to maybe leave the door open here and say, okay, I might consider it, but you got to ask me first, then all you have to do is add this little clause here, without the landlord's written permission. This one, I pulled both the Chicago apartment lease and the Main Street organization lease that mostly applies to the south suburbs. Cook County has this exact clause in here. So it says sublease. Tenant shall not assign or sublet any part of the lease premises. And then again, it's up to you without prior written consent of the landlord, whether you want to put this little clause in here or not. If you don't, leave it out. And no person shall occupy the premises except tenants. Subletting does not release any tenants or co-signers from the lease agreement terms, including paying rent. I like this one here because it very, very clearly spells out, hey, if you sublease it out, you're still going to be, liable for the rent and the other lease terms. So if you don't want, going back a slide, if you don't want to allow any subleasing whatsoever like this, in renting out a portion of the property, make sure that in your lease, you have this type of a lease clause in here. And again, it's up to you whether you want to say, nope, there is no subleasing whatsoever, or, all right, I may consider it, but you have to ask me first. I have to give you written permission. Okay, so that's one type of sublease. And that's the end. Part one, I guess, of the answer is, do landlords have to allow subleasing? No, not for this type of subleasing when a portion of the property is being rented out. Let's take a look at that type 2 type of subleasing there. Remember, this is the one where the original tenant is no longer there. They actually completely leave the property and they end up renting out the entire property to a new tenant. So that new tenant then takes over, whatever is left over of the original lease. This is the answer to the question, where do the landlords, are landlords allowed to prohibit this type of subleasing? This is where, again, it's sort of, the answer was, well, it depends. If you live outside of Chicago and Illinois, the answer is yes. You can prohibit this type of subleasing. Don't forget though, just make sure that you have that lease clause in there that says, nope, no subleasing is allowed, just like we did for the first type of subleasing. Let me go back a slide. So in other words, don't forget to put a clause there in your lease that says no subleasing. If you are in the rest of Illinois outside of Chicago and Cook County, you are allowed to prohibit this type of sublease. But I think I mentioned when we first started talking here, of course, Chicago and Cook County, we always have all of these special rules and regulations. In this case, we cannot prohibit this type of subleasing. And a lot of landlords don't like this because, I mean, this is why I started out the presentation saying landlords, we just feel very uneasy about being forced to accept subleases. But the Chicago and Cook County ordinance say we can't prohibit them. So let's take a quick look at that one, or these. So the Chicago Residential Landlord Tenant Ordinance and the Cook County Residential Tenant. Did I flip those out? Yeah, that's right. The Chicago RTLO. These are the ordinances that I'm talking about. And what they say is if the tenant abandons the property, in other words, I don't know why they said abandons, but basically if the tenant, moves out of the property, the landlord must make every effort to re-rent the property at fair market value, which is, that's common sense. We all do that. But this is the clause that we're interested in, including accepting reasonable subleases. And this is exactly what the ordinance say, reasonable subleases. So because of this, these ordinances only apply to that second type of sublease where the tenant, leaves the rental property. We as landlords cannot prohibit our current tenant from finding a new tenant to come in and take over that lease. In Chicago, there's also the Chicago RLTO also has one more tiny little clause in there about subleases, and they say that the landlord cannot charge additional fees for the sublease. Let me hold off on that one because I'm going to tie it over to Jeffrey's question here in a little bit. But so basically, again, just to summarize, this is the answer to the question about, can landlords prohibit subleases? In Chicago and Cook County, the answer is no. I think that causes us, a lot of anxiety when we're forced to do something like this. So if we are in Chicago and Cook County and we want to have a sublease clause in our lease, we have to have ours to be slightly different than the one I mentioned that I showed you here a little bit earlier. So earlier, the one said, tenant shall not sublease any portion of the premises without the prior written consent of the landlord, exactly like the first clause I showed you. But check out the difference between Cook County and Chicago. This one also has this little clause, which shall not be unreasonably withheld. So this is specifically states that we can't say no to, these subleases. And then this is just a nice, I think I took this from the Main Street Organization of Realtors lease and the Chicago lease. It does have some nice stipulations in there where it does say the landlord may require the tenant to enter into a formal written sublease agreement. Any sublease of the premises shall not release the tenant from the tenant's obligation, blah, blah, blah. Tenant shall be liable for any monetary or non-monetary breaches. So if you're in Chicago and Cook County, make sure that you have a sublease clause like this, but you can't say, nope, I'm not going to take it. You have to have a clause in there that says, yep, I'll consider it. Basically, I can't unreasonably say no to this. So what does that mean for us in Chicago and Cook County? So we're talking about the sublease situation where the original tenant finds somebody to take over the remaining portion of the lease. We must allow it. But let me explain what that means because there's a caveat there. That doesn't mean that the landlord has to automatically accept, anybody for the sublease. They use this very specific clause in there that landlords have to accept reasonable subleases. And I put it there in quotes because that's exactly what, oops, hold on one second. I lost my video. There we go. So what that means then is we have to accept reasonable subleases. That is good for us, but it's also a little bit vague, right? I mean, what is a reasonable sublease? Who decides what a reasonable sublease is? There's no really explanation in the Chicago or the Cook County ordinances that say this is what constitutes a reasonable sublease. So it's a little bit open to interpretation. So these are sort of the guidelines I think we should use when we're trying to go through deciding whether what is a reasonable sublease. And then Jeffrey, this goes to your question here about screening. In order for it to be a reasonable sublease, we as landlords do have the right to screen the new tenant using the same process we would for any type of tenant, and we have the right to use the same criteria that we would for that we use for the original tenant or any tenant whatsoever. That gives us the right to reject the new tenant if they don't qualify. So let me sort of rephrase that in a different way just to make sure that everybody understands. So you're the landlord, you've got the lease with a tenant. This new tenant decides that they want to leave, and they want to find their own replacement and have a sublease situation where the new person takes over their lease. You're the landlord. If you're in Chicago and Cook County, you can't say no, but you do have the right to screen them and to make sure that they meet your rental criteria. If you're going through and you screen them and they fail that screening, maybe their credit is horrible, or they've had an eviction, or the credit score is super low, or whatever your criteria are, if they don't meet it, you do have the right to reject them. So that would be considered a reasonable sublease because they're, any court, any legal entity would recognize that it is reasonable to have the new tenant meet the landlord's criteria. If they don't, then you do have a right to say no. So that's good for us. The other thing to remember, even though the Chicago and Cook County ordinance say, yep, we must accept subleases, we can require the new tenant to follow the same lease terms as the original tenant. It's not like all of a sudden the new tenant is free to do whatever they want. There's all sorts of new rules and regulations for them that are different from the original lease. That's not the case. They have to follow your original lease terms. And if they don't, you can evict them. You can, fine them, whatever the lease violation penalties are, you can impose that upon. So hopefully that clarifies it with everybody. It's not great that we in Chicago and Cook County are sort of forced to take subleases, but it's good that they the authors of the ordinances did say we do have a right to accept reasonable subleases, so we do have the right to screen them and we have the right to reject them. Now, Jeffrey, you asked an interesting question about charging them. Let me go back to your question here. So Jeffrey said, can you charge for the same credit and investigative checks you would make for a vacancy? That's an interesting question because I would automatically say, yep, you can, because it's part of the screening process, so we should be able to. But I'm just kind of wondering, let me go back a couple of slides, because here, when I was reviewing the Chicago ordinance, there is a little clause that says the landlord cannot charge additional fees for a sublease. So I'm kind of wondering if that applies to the screening fees. My gut feeling is no, that it doesn't, that you can pass along the screening fees to, the new tenant who's going to sublease. I kind of think what they're referring to here is, if the rent you're charging is $1,000 for your original tenant, you can't all of a sudden say, okay, now I'm going to charge $1,200 of rent for the new tenant, or I'm going to tack on an additional, $300 a month fee, or whatever, creative fees that we want to add on. We can't do that, but I'm not quite sure. So that's an interesting situation. I would still go ahead and charge the screening fees, but just kind of be aware of this little situation here in Chicago. So Jeffrey, hopefully that answers your question. Let me go back over here. I think we had a couple more comments here. And then Jeffrey was saying, must the landlord advertise for both? The sublease is available and ends at lease expiration, and the lease available for the new term. So that's a good question too, Jeffrey, because the landlord is not responsible for the sublease. So if your current tenant says, hey, I want to leave, I want to terminate my lease, you're not responsible for finding that new sublease situation. It's your existing tenant, your original tenant, that would create that sublease situation. If your current, your original tenant, your existing tenant doesn't find somebody to replace them, that's it. Then they're on the hook for the early lease termination, and all of that clause, kicks in there. So you don't really need to advertise, hey, a sublease is available. If your existing tenant doesn't find somebody to replace them, then the lease terminates and you just advertise for a brand new lease with a brand new tenant. Good question. Okay, so this is why I think, like I said, when I started to answer Gerardo's question, when he asked about the subleases, I was like, oh, it's easy. And hopefully now you see it's not. It depends on, if my property's in Chicago and Cook County, and it also depends on what type of lease I have. And even though Chicago and Cook County say, yep, I must allow subleases, we do have a little bit of loopholes in that we are allowed to screen and, accept these new tenants or reject them if we want.